I used my last dollar to bid on a farm I'd never set foot inside. The craziest part, that wasn't even the worst decision I made that day. 6 months later, standing in a century-old cellar with a rusted safe at my feet, I'd realized the real mistake was thinking I could control what happened next. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The thing about desperation is it whispers in your voice until you can't tell the difference anymore. For 6 years after Christopher died, I heard it every morning when the alarm screamed at 5:30. Heard it in the clatter of plates at Dorothy's diner, in the forced brightness of my voice, asking strangers if they wanted more coffee. Heard it loudest in the silence of our apartment after midnight, when Matthew and Michelle slept, and I sat alone with bills spread across the kitchen table, like tarot cards predicting the same bleak future. The farmhouse sat 3 miles off County Road 47, visible from the highway for exactly 8 seconds if you knew where to look. I'd driven past it hundreds of times on my way to work, always wondering the same thing: who lived there once, and why did they leave? The red barn sagged like an old man's shoulders. The windows stared empty. The orchard had gone wild, apple trees twisted into shapes that looked like they were trying to escape their own roots. I never imagined I'd try to buy it. Never imagined I'd stand in front of a crowd with a bidder's card trembling in my hand, gambling everything Christopher left us on a property that needed $100,000 just to become livable. But 6 years of safety had taught me something. Sometimes the only thing more dangerous than taking a risk is spending your whole life avoiding one. The day started normal. I poured coffee for truck drivers who didn't look at my face, carried plates of eggs and bacon to farmers who left dollar tips on $12 checks. Dorothy moved through the kitchen like she'd been doing it since birth, which wasn't far from true. She'd inherited the diner from her mother, who'd inherited it from hers. 3 generations of women in the same building serving the same menu to the same families. Continuity, roots, legacy, things I didn't have anymore. My shift ended at 2. I peeled off my apron, stuffed it in my locker, and felt my phone buzz. Matthew. Home from school, checking in like he'd been doing since he was 9 years old, since he decided he had to be the man of the house because Christopher couldn't. Everything okay, I typed back. Fine. Auction at 4. Might be late. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Good luck, Mom. No pressure there. Just my 14-year-old son believing in something I barely believed in myself. The drive to Riverbend Farm took 17 minutes. I'd timed it twice. The auction company had hammered signs into the ground near the driveway, bright orange against the autumn brown of dying grass. Cars lined both sides of the road. More than I'd expected. More than I'd hoped. I parked behind a pickup truck with a Ridgeline Development decal on the bumper and felt my stomach drop. They were here. The company that had bought 6 foreclosed properties in Harrison County in the past year. The company that bulldozed century-old barns and planted McMansions in their place. If they wanted Riverbend, I was finished before I started. Matthew and Michelle waited by the fence. Matthew had put on a button-down shirt without me asking. Michelle clutched her lucky rock, a smooth piece of granite she'd found by the creek 2 summers ago. She squeezed it so hard her knuckles went white. Dorothy's white catering van sat in the makeshift parking area. She'd closed the diner for the afternoon, told the staff to come support me. I saw them clustered near the barn, Rita, Marcus, young Tommy, still in his cook's apron. They waved. I waved back and wanted to cry. If I failed, I'd fail in front of everyone who believed I could do this. The auctioneer stood on the sagging porch, a heavy man with a voice that carried across the property without a microphone. He outlined the terms while I tried to focus. Cash or pre-approved financing. 10% deposit due immediately. Closing within 30 days. Property sold as is, no warranties. I'd registered that morning, shown my pre-approval letter from the county credit union. They'd given me $78,000 at 9% interest secured against Christopher's life insurance money. Combined with what I had in savings, I could bid up to $110,000, not a penny more. The credit union officer had looked at me like I was signing my own execution warrant. Maybe I was. Bidder number 17. They'd given me a card with the number printed in black. I held it against my chest, waiting. The man in the crisp suit stood near the porch steps, phone in one hand, tablet in the other. Kenneth Anderson. I'd looked him up online. Regional Director for Ridgeline Development. LinkedIn said he'd overseen 47 successful acquisitions in the past 3 years. Every single one demolished, rezoned, rebuilt as luxury housing. He didn't look at me, didn't look at anyone, just studied his tablet like the farm was already his. The auctioneer's voice boomed out, starting bid $85,000. Do I have 85? My hand went up before I could overthink it. The card caught the afternoon sun. 85,000 from bidder 17. Do I hear 90? Kenneth Anderson raised one finger, didn't even lift his head. 90,000. Do I hear 95? My throat felt tight. I raised the card again. 95 from 17. 100. Kenneth's finger again. Casual, like he was ordering lunch. The numbers climbed. 100,000, 105, 110. Each time I bid, my heart hammered harder. Each time Kenneth countered, his expression never changed. At 110,000, I held my card against my chest and didn't raise it. That was my limit, the absolute ceiling. I couldn't go higher even if I wanted to. Kenneth's voice cut through the crowd for the first time, directed at the auctioneer. 115,000. The auctioneer scanned the crowd. His eyes found mine. I shook my head slightly, felt the card grow heavy in my hands. 115,000 going once. Michelle's fingers found mine. She didn't say anything, didn't need to. Going twice. I closed my eyes, heard Christopher's voice in my head the way he used to quote his grandfather. The only real failure is never trying. But Christopher had never tried to buy a farm with 2 kids depending on him. Christopher had never felt the weight of knowing one wrong decision could destroy everything. 120,000. The voice came from behind me. Female, clear, carrying the kind of authority that made the auctioneer pause mid-swing. I turned, saw a woman in her mid-60s, silver hair, pulled back practical jacket over jeans. She held bidder card number 8 like she'd been born with it in her hand. Kenneth Anderson's head came up for the first time. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe? Or recognition? His finger rose again. 125,000. The silver-haired woman didn't hesitate. 130,000. A murmur ran through the crowd. The property wasn't worth that much. Everyone knew it. The county assessor had it listed at 92,000 in its current condition. Whoever won at this price was either desperate or crazy. Kenneth spoke into his phone, low and urgent, listened. His jaw tightened. 135,000. The woman's response came before the auctioneer could even repeat the bid. 150,000. Someone behind me gasped. Kenneth Anderson stared at the woman like he was trying to solve a puzzle. She stared back, expression neutral, unreadable. The auctioneer waited. Kenneth shook his head once, sharp and final. 150,000 going once, going twice. The gavel cracked against the porch railing. Sold to bidder number 8. The numbness I'd expected didn't come. Instead, I felt something close to relief. The decision had been taken out of my hands. I could go home, tell Matthew and Michelle we'd tried keep working at the diner until something else came along. Stay safe. The crowd began to disperse. Kenneth Anderson strode toward the woman with the kind of purposeful walk that said he wasn't asking, he was demanding. I started to turn away to collect my children and leave before anyone saw the tears building behind my eyes. Rachel Flores. The silver-haired woman stood 3 feet away. Up close I could see laugh lines around her eyes, calluses on her hands. She smiled, and it looked genuine. How do you know my name? Small town. And I do my homework before I spend money. She extended her hand. Margaret Wilson. I shook it automatically. Her grip was firm, confident. Congratulations on your purchase. Thank you, though I'm hoping it might not be just mine. She glanced past me to where Matthew and Michelle stood watching. "Those are your children, Matthew and Michelle?" A cold finger traced down my spine. "How much do you know about me?" "Enough to know you worked double shifts at Dorothy's diner. Enough to know you lost your husband 6 years ago. Enough to know you've been driving past this farm for months, slowing down every time." Her eyes met mine direct, but not unkind. "Enough to know you deserve a chance to do something more than survive." Kenneth Anderson materialized beside us before I could respond. His professional smile didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Wilson, I'd like to make you an offer. $200,000 cash, close within a week." Margaret didn't even look at him. "No." "250,000, final offer." "Mr. Anderson, I said no." Now she did turn, and her voice could have frosted glass. "I'm having a private conversation." His smile vanished. He looked at me instead, and something in his expression made my skin crawl. "You don't know what you're getting into here." Then he walked away, phone already at his ear. Margaret watched him go. Charming man. What did he mean? Nothing important. But her tone said otherwise. She pulled a business card from her pocket, pressed it into my hand. "Would you and your children join me for lunch? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Matthew appeared at my elbow. "Mom, we should probably go." Margaret smiled at him. "You must be Matthew. I hear you're quite the entrepreneur. Lawn mowing business, isn't it?" Matthew blinked. "How did you—" "Your mother's co-workers are very proud of both of you. They talk." She shifted her attention to Michelle. "And you must be Michelle. That's a beautiful rock. Is it granite?" Michelle nodded, shy but curious. "I found it by the creek." "Good eye. Granite lasts forever, like some other things if you take care of them properly." Margaret looked at me again. "Lunch? Dorothy's diner, perhaps. Say in an hour?" I should have said no. Should have taken my kids home, counted my blessings that I wasn't drowning in debt for a property I couldn't afford. But something in Margaret Wilson's eyes reminded me of my grandfather. The way he used to look at his orchard like he could see past what it was to what it could become. "We'll be there." The diner felt different walking in as a customer instead of a waitress. Dorothy met us at the door, saw Margaret Wilson behind me, and her eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. She seated us in the corner booth without a word, brought coffee for Margaret and me, chocolate milk for Michelle. Margaret waited until Dorothy left before opening the manila folder she'd carried in. "I'll be direct, Rachel. I didn't come to this auction planning to keep the farm." My coffee turned cold in my mouth. "Then why bid?" "Because I didn't want Ridgeline Development to have it, and because I wanted to meet you." She slid a document across the table. "This is a proposal. I'd like you to read it carefully." The letterhead said Wilson Rural Preservation Trust. The proposal underneath made my head spin. Margaret's trust would retain ownership of the land. I would have a 99-year lease with an option to purchase after 5 years. The trust would provide $175,000 in restoration capital over 3 years. I would own any agricultural business I developed outright. "I don't understand. You want me to be your employee?" "Partner, not employee." Margaret tapped the document. "You would manage the restoration of the orchard, develop whatever agricultural business makes sense. The trust owns the dirt. You own everything you build on it." "Why?" The question came out sharper than I intended. "You don't know me. I'm a waitress with no farming experience. Why would you risk this kind of money on me?" Margaret's expression shifted, and for a moment I saw past the confidence to something raw underneath. "I lost my family's farm 30 years ago. Foreclosure. I was building my career as a corporate lawyer, too important to come home when my parents needed me." Her fingers traced the edge of her coffee cup. "By the time I made enough money to buy it back, developers had already torn everything down. Built a subdivision called Orchard View. There's not a single fruit tree left." "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Just don't make my mistake." She looked at Matthew and Michelle. "I see myself in you, Rachel. 30 years ago, before I chose safety over dreams, this is my chance to help someone choose differently." Matthew leaned forward, eyes bright. We'd live there at the farm. There's a cottage on the property. 2 bedrooms need some work, but it's structurally sound. You could move in within 2 weeks. Margaret's attention stayed on me. I won't pretend this will be easy. The orchard needs years of rehabilitation. The buildings need extensive repairs. You'll work harder than you ever have at the diner with no guarantee of success. Then why offer it? Because sometimes the best investments aren't the ones that guarantee returns. They're the ones that give someone a chance to build something that matters. She paused. What do you know about heritage apple varieties? My grandfather grew apples in Michigan. I spent summers there as a kid. Then you have more relevant experience than you think. Riverbend Farm was established in 1886 by a man named Thomas River. He was known for experimental grafting, trying to develop varieties that combined flavor with disease resistance. The orchard's been abandoned for 3 years, but those genetics are still there. If even a fraction of his work survived, it could be valuable. Michelle tugged my sleeve. Mom, can I see the room with the window seat? I stared at my daughter. What window seat? The one in my room. At the farm. Margaret smiled. The southeast bedroom in the main house. 2nd floor, built-in window seat with storage underneath. Best view on the property. You've been inside? I asked. Twice. Once with the County Historical Society, once with a structural engineer. The main farmhouse needs too much work for immediate occupancy, but in 3 to 5 years it could be spectacular. The cottage, though, that's livable now. Dorothy appeared with plates of food none of us had ordered. Club sandwiches for Margaret and me, grilled cheese for Michelle, a burger for Matthew. She set them down and vanished again without a word. Margaret picked up her sandwich. Take the weekend. Look over the proposal. Visit the property. I'll call Gary Thompson, the caretaker, give you full access. Think about what you want your life to look like in 5 years. Then call me Monday morning. What if I say no? Then I'll find someone else. But I don't think you will. She met my eyes. You didn't drive past that farm 100 times because you were curious about the architecture. You drove past it because some part of you recognized it as home. Kenneth Anderson appeared at the diner's entrance. His eyes found our table and his expression went cold. He crossed the room in 6 strides. Ms. Wilson, I need 5 minutes of your time. Mr. Anderson, I'm having lunch with friends. $275,000, cash, close tomorrow. Margaret set down her sandwich with deliberate care. The answer is no. It will remain no at $300,000, $400,000, or any other number you'd like to suggest. Riverbend Farm is not for sale. Now please leave me to enjoy my meal. Kenneth's jaw worked. He looked at me, and something in his expression made the hair on my neck stand up. You don't understand what you're turning down here. I understand perfectly. Margaret's voice could have cut steel. You want to bulldoze a piece of agricultural history and replace it with McMansions. I've seen your work in Millbrook County. Very profitable, very ugly, very permanent. That's business. So is this. Goodbye, Mr. Anderson. He left. But the threat lingered in the air after he'd gone. Matthew watched him go. Mom, he's kind of scary. He's just a businessman, honey. But Margaret shook her head. He's more than that. Ridgeline has been buying up properties in this county for 18 months. They're assembling parcels for something big. Riverbend sits right in the middle of their target area. She pushed her plate away. That's why the offer matters, Rachel. If you say yes, you're not just saving one farm. You're throwing a wrench into their plans. They'll push back. How hard? Hard enough that you need to be certain before you commit. I looked at my children. Matthew trying so hard to be brave. Michelle already imagining her room in a house we didn't own. Then I looked at the proposal at numbers that seemed simultaneously impossible and inevitable. I'll call you Monday. We drove home in silence. Matthew stared out the window. Michelle hummed to herself some song I didn't recognize. I gripped the steering wheel and tried to remember how to breathe. The apartment waited for us on the third floor of a converted Victorian 2 bedrooms, carved from what used to be a single room. Matthew and Michelle shared the larger bedroom. I slept in what had probably been a closet once. The kitchen was barely wide enough for one person. The bathroom had pipes that groaned every time someone showered. It was home. For 6 years it had been home. But standing in the doorway looking at the space we'd squeezed our lives into, I couldn't shake the image of Riverbend Farm, the orchard going wild, the empty windows, the bones of something beautiful waiting for someone to see past the decay. Matthew made himself a sandwich. Michelle sprawled on the floor with her homework. I opened my laptop and pulled up everything I could find about heritage apples, grafting techniques, cider production. Fell down a rabbit hole of articles about Thomas River, the experimental farmer who'd owned Riverbend from 1886 until his death in 1924. He'd written papers on disease-resistant rootstock, cold-hardy varieties, flavor profiling. The state agricultural extension had a whole section dedicated to his work. He'd died without children. The farm had passed to a distant cousin, then to another cousin, then to a corporation that went bankrupt. 3 years ago, the bank foreclosed. It had sat empty since. All those genetics, all that knowledge, just waiting in abandoned rows of apple trees. I worked until 2 in the morning, building spreadsheets, running numbers, mapping scenarios. Best case, we restored the orchard, developed a small cidery sold to local restaurants and specialty stores. Worst case, we poured 3 years of our lives into dirt that gave us nothing back, and I ended up deeper in debt than when I started. Christopher would have called that thinking like a pessimist. Christopher would have said faith wasn't about guarantees. It was about believing the work mattered regardless of the outcome. Christopher was dead, though, and I was the one who had to keep Matthew and Michelle fed. Saturday morning I called Gary Thompson, the caretaker. His voice sounded like gravel and honey. "Margaret said you'd be calling. Come on out whenever you like. I'll be there all day." We drove to Riverbend under a sky-threatening rain. Gary waited on the cottage porch, a lean man in his 70s with the kind of hands that had done a lifetime of real work. He shook my hand, nodded to Matthew and Michelle. "Let's start with the cottage. It's not fancy, but it's solid." He wasn't lying. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a living area that flowed into a small kitchen. The walls needed paint, the floors needed refinishing, but the bones were good. The windows let in light that made the dust motes dance like snow. Michelle ran from room to room narrating her future. "This is where I'll put my bookshelf. This is where my desk will go. Can I have curtains with stars on them?" Gary smiled. "Reckon you can have any kind of curtains you want." Matthew moved more slowly, measuring spaces with his eyes. "The internet connection out here good enough for video calls. Fiber optic came through last year. County project, fast as you'd get in town." We walked the property after that. Gary pointed out the apple orchard, the old dairy barn with the collapsed roof, the smaller barn that could be converted to storage or workshop space. The main farmhouse loomed at the end of a gravel drive, 3 stories of Victorian architecture slowly surrendering to gravity. "Foundation's good," Gary said. "Roof needs replacing. Most of the interior needs gutting and rebuilding. But the bones," he patted a porch column, "the bones remember what they're supposed to be." I climbed the porch steps, carefully testing each one. The front door hung crooked but opened when I pushed. Inside, the air smelled like dust and thyme. Wide plank floors stretched toward a massive stone fireplace. Built-in cabinets lined one wall, the wood hand-carved with a craftsmanship you couldn't buy anymore. Michelle found the window seat in the southeast bedroom. She sat in it looking out at the orchard, and something in her face made my throat tight. "This is it, Mom. This is my room." Sunday we stayed home. I made phone calls, talked to the agricultural extension office, contacted a cider maker in the next county who agreed to meet with me if I was serious. Made a list of everything that needed doing and felt the list grow longer every time I thought I'd finished. Matthew found me at the kitchen table after midnight, my laptop surrounded by printouts and scribbled notes. "You're going to say yes, aren't you?" I looked at my son. 14 years old, trying so hard to be the man Christopher should have been. I don't know yet. Dad would think it's a great idea. Your father was always the dreamer. I was the practical one. Maybe it's time you dreamed a little. He sat across from me, picked up one of my spreadsheets. I've been researching too. Heritage apple varieties are making a comeback. Restaurants want local, want unique, want stories. We'd have all three. When did you get so smart? Around the same time you started working 60-hour weeks. He said it without accusation, just fact. But it still cut. I reached across the table, took his hand. If we do this, everything changes. New school for both of you. No more walking to your friends' houses. Farm work before homework. And if it fails, then we try something else. But at least we tried. His words echoed in my head Monday morning as I dialed Margaret Wilson's number. She answered on the second ring. Margaret, it's Rachel Flores. And I have one condition. Silence. Then, I'm listening. I want a clear path to ownership. 5 years working the farm, building the business, improving the property. I want the right to purchase at fair market value with credit given for the improvements I make. More silence. I counted my heartbeats. I'll have the contract amended. Anything else? Why are you really doing this? Not the story about your family's farm. The real reason. Margaret's exhale carried across the line. Because I'm 65 years old and I've spent 30 years making money. I want to spend whatever time I have left making something that matters. Your family at Riverbend matters. Does that answer your question? Yes. Then we have a deal. I'll have the paperwork ready by Wednesday. You can move in as soon as you'd like. I gave notice at Dorothy's that afternoon. She hugged me so hard I couldn't breathe, pressed an envelope into my hand after. Inside, $450 and a card signed by every staff member. For the farm. Make us proud. The next week blurred. Packing the apartment. Coordinating with Margaret's contractors who descended on the cottage like a benevolent invasion force. 3 carpenters, 2 plumbers, an electrician. They worked with the kind of speed that said Margaret had paid extra for urgency. Gary Thompson showed up every morning with coffee and updates. Dorothy closed the diner one Saturday and brought her entire staff to help us move. Boxes multiplied, filled with our lives compressed into cardboard and newspaper. Matthew labeled everything with his neat handwriting. Michelle packed her stuffed animals with the kind of care usually reserved for relics. 2 weeks after the auction, I stood in the cottage at Riverbend Farm, surrounded by boxes but also by space. Real space. Room to breathe. Matthew and Michelle had already claimed their bedroom, were arranging furniture and arguing good-naturedly about whose poster went where. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the orchard, at apple trees that had survived 3 years of abandonment and decades before that of whatever Thomas River had asked them to endure. If trees could survive that long, maybe I could survive this. Margaret arrived that evening with a rolled document under her arm. I found something at the county archives. Thought you might want to see it. She spread it across the kitchen table. The original plans for Riverbend Farm dated 1886, hand-drawn, with the kind of precision that bordered on art. Every building, every fence line, every tree row mapped in ink that had faded but not disappeared. Look at page 3. I separated the pages carefully, found the one she meant. Floor plans for the main house basement to attic. And they're clearly marked in the foundation plan, a rectangle labeled storage vault. Is that what I think it is? Margaret smiled. Gary mentioned Thomas River didn't trust banks. Apparently he had good reason. Every bank in the county failed during the panic of 1893. Thomas kept his money at home. You think there's actually a safe down there? Only one way to find out. We descended into the farmhouse basement the next morning, Margaret, Gary, and me. The stairs creaked. The air tasted like stone and darkness. Gary's flashlight beam found the east wall, picked out the section where the stonework changed from field stone to cut blocks. Here. He knelt, brushed dirt away from the floor near the wall's base. An iron ring emerged, small enough to miss if you weren't looking for it. I grabbed it, pulled. Nothing happened. Gary added his strength, and slowly the stone slid forward, revealing a lever beneath. "Counterweight system," he said admiringly. Thomas was a craftsman. I pulled the lever. Something groaned inside the wall. Then a section of the stonework shifted, slid sideways, revealed a cavity beyond. The safe sat there like it had been waiting 100 years for us to find it. Cast iron, 3 feet tall, 2 feet wide. The nameplate read, Thomas River, Riverbend Farm. Margaret's flashlight found numbers scratched into the margin of the blueprint she'd brought, 1842-7. Worth trying. My hand shook as I reached for the dial. Right to 18, left to 42, right to 7. I held my breath and pulled the handle. It clicked. Then the door swung open with a shriek of metal that hadn't moved in decades. Inside, ledgers bound in leather, bundles of papers tied with ribbon, a cloth sack that clinked, a wooden box carved with apple blossoms. No fortune, no gold bars, just the carefully preserved records of a man's life work. I lifted out the wooden box, opened it on the dusty basement floor. Thomas River's journal, leather-bound and handwritten, and beneath it an envelope addressed in faded ink, "To the future steward of Riverbend." My fingers trembled opening it. The letter inside was dated 1924. I read it aloud, my voice echoing in the old basement. "To whoever finds this, if you are reading these words, you have discovered the legacy of Riverbend Farm, and I hope have taken up its stewardship. I established this farm in 1886 with the belief that this land properly tended could support generations to come. In this safe, you will find the financial history of our endeavors, research that may prove valuable to future orchardists, and a modest emergency fund that has helped our family weather several economic storms. The true wealth of Riverbend, however, lies not in gold, but in the land itself, specifically in the North Orchard, where I have cultivated what I believe to be unique apple varieties that combine the best qualities of durability, flavor, and disease resistance. It is my hope that whoever discovers this vault values not just its monetary contents, but the agricultural heritage it represents. May Riverbend continue to bear fruit for generations yet unborn. With respect and optimism for the future, Thomas River, 1924. The silence after I finished reading felt holy somehow. Margaret's eyes were wet. Gary had taken off his hat. "The North Orchard," I finally said. "Where's that most overgrown section? Haven't touched it in the 3 years since the bank took over." Gary's voice carried reverence. "If his experimental trees are still alive after all this time, after all that neglect, they'd be incredibly resilient," Margaret finished. "Exactly the kind of genetics that matter now when everyone wants organic, wants hardy, wants something that can survive without constant chemical intervention." I looked down at the letter in my hands, at words written by a man who'd died before my grandparents were born. He'd planted trees for people he'd never meet, preserved knowledge for inheritors he couldn't imagine, built something meant to outlast him by a century or more, and somehow, impossibly, I was holding the proof that it had worked. That night I sat alone in the cottage with Thomas River's journal. The children slept in their new bedroom. Outside, the orchard stretched dark under stars I'd never been able to see from our apartment. I opened the journal to a random page, November 1889. Thomas wrote about gratitude, about how it expands to fill whatever vessel holds it, about how the farm was raw potential when he arrived, how much work remained, but how he found himself thankful, not despite the challenges, but because of them. To build something enduring requires effort worthy of that endurance. The words seemed to reach across 100 years and grip my heart. I'd spent 6 years surviving, playing it safe, protecting my children from risk because I'd already lost so much. But safety wasn't the same as living, and maybe the best way to honor Christopher's memory wasn't to avoid risk, it was to take the kind of leap he never got the chance to take. I pulled out a pen and opened to the last page of the journal where Thomas's final entry dated March 1924 ended mid-sentence. Below it, in the space he'd left blank, I wrote, "Thomas, my name is Rachel Flores. I found your safe today. Tomorrow I'm going to find your trees. I don't know if I can do this. But you taught me something tonight. Faith isn't about knowing the outcome. It's about believing the work matters anyway. Thank you for planting trees for people like me. I'll do my best to deserve them." I closed the journal, set it carefully on the table, and walked out onto the cottage porch. The November wind carried the scent of earth and apples sharp and clean. Somewhere in the darkness those experimental trees waited. Maybe dying. Maybe thriving. I wouldn't know until I looked. But standing there in the cold, breathing air that tasted like possibility, I realized Christopher had been right about one thing. The only real failure was never trying. Tomorrow we'd start clearing the north orchard. Tomorrow we'd see what Thomas Rivers' century of patience had preserved. Tonight, for the first time in 6 years, I felt something that wasn't desperation whispering in my voice. I felt hope. The Saturday after we found Thomas Rivers' safe word spread through Harrison County like pollen on spring wind. By 8 in the morning, 20 people stood in Riverbend's overgrown fields with chainsaws, brush cutters, and the kind of determination that embarrassed me into silence. I hadn't asked for this, hadn't expected it. Dorothy arrived first, coffee urns in her van. Then came Robert White, the third-generation dairy farmer whose property bordered ours to the west. His sons brought equipment I couldn't have rented with a month's wages. The high school agriculture teacher showed up with 6 students who needed volunteer hours and got more than they bargained for when they saw the north orchard. 3 acres of wilderness, volunteer saplings choking the spaces between rows, brambles thick enough to hide a car, and somewhere in that tangle Thomas Rivers' experimental trees if they'd survived. Gary Thompson directed traffic like a general positioning troops. He'd walked this property for 3 years as caretaker, knew every fence post and drainage ditch. Watching him organize strangers into teams, I understood why Margaret trusted him. The woman who stepped out of a dusty pickup at 9:30 didn't look like she belonged at a farm cleanup. Red hair pulled into a practical braid, university sweatshirt, clipboard under one arm. She approached me directly, hand extended. "Dr. Patricia Clark, Pomology Department, State University. I heard about Thomas Rivers' safe." My handshake felt weak next to hers. News travels fast. When someone finds potentially undocumented heritage apple varieties, news travels at light speed in my field. Her eyes tracked past me to the north orchard. "How many trees are we talking about?" "We don't know yet. Haven't been able to get in there." "Mind if I tag along when you do?" By noon, we'd carved the first path into the orchard's heart. Chainsaws screamed. Brush fell in heaps. Matthew worked alongside Robert White's oldest son, both of them red-faced and grinning like they'd discovered gold. Michelle appointed herself water coordinator, made sure everyone stayed hydrated. And slowly, impossibly, the trees emerged. Gnarled, unpruned for years, maybe decades, branches twisted into shapes that defied logic, but alive. Unquestionably, defiantly alive. Dr. Clark moved through them with the reverence of someone entering a cathedral. She'd pull a leaf, examine it against the light, make notes on her clipboard. Sometimes she'd stop, stare at a tree, and shake her head like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "This one." She pointed to a specimen near the center, its trunk thick as my waist. "I've never seen bark patterns quite like this. And the leaf shape," she photographed it from 6 angles. "I need to run DNA analysis, but I'd bet my tenure this isn't in any database." We counted 50 trees total by the time darkness forced us to stop. 50 survivors from whatever Thomas River had planted over a century ago. Dr. Clark had flagged 17 as potentially unique varieties. The volunteers left exhausted and happy. Dorothy's staff had brought sandwiches. People ate standing up, too tired to sit, but nobody complained. This was the kind of tired that felt like accomplishment. Dr. Clark found me as I was thanking people for the 100th time. "I'll need leaf samples from all 17 flagged trees. DNA analysis takes about 2 weeks, but I can rush it if the university approves the funding. What are we looking for exactly? Genetic markers that don't match known cultivars. If Thomas really developed new varieties, their DNA will be distinct. And if they've survived this long without human intervention. She paused, choosing words. That kind of hardiness is exactly what modern growers need. Climate change, disease pressure, reduced chemical inputs. Trees that can thrive under stress are worth their weight in gold. The comparison felt too apt. I'd been thriving under stress for 6 years. Maybe Thomas Rivers' trees and I had more in common than genetics. Dr. Clark returned 2 weeks later with results that made my hands shake reading them. 5 of the 17 trees were completely unique. No matches in any horticultural database. Thomas River hadn't just been experimenting, he'd succeeded in creating distinct varieties, and they'd survived long enough for us to find them. But the real surprise came buried in the technical language of the 3rd page. One variety showed genetic markers associated with exceptional disease resistance, particularly to apple scab and fire blight. Dr. Clark circled it twice. This could be commercially significant, Rachel, not just for cider production, for breeding programs, for organic growers who can't rely on fungicides. She met my eyes. The university wants to license rights for research. They're offering $20,000 annually for 5 years renewable. $20,000 for trees I hadn't planted, for genetics I'd just discovered. What would that mean for the orchard? We'd take cuttings, propagate them, study their characteristics. You'd retain ownership of the original trees and any fruit they produce. We just need access to the genetic material. She hesitated. There's also interest from 3 commercial nurseries who want to propagate these varieties for sale. That could be another revenue stream. I sat down on a stack of lumber Gary had been using to repair the barn. The numbers spun in my head, rearranging what I thought was possible. How fast can we make this happen? I need your signature on the licensing agreement. University lawyers are drawing it up now. Should be ready within a week. Kenneth Anderson's black SUV appeared in my driveway 3 days after Dr. Clark's second visit. I was in the orchard marking trees for pruning. Gary saw him first, caught my eye, and nodded toward the house. Kenneth stood on the cottage porch like he owned it, suit perfectly pressed despite the November mud, smile that never reached his eyes. Rachel, the orchard's looking better. What do you want, Kenneth? To make you an offer, a real one this time. He gestured toward the fields. I've heard about the apple varieties, the university interest. Impressive work. Thank you. Goodbye. $3 million. The number stopped me mid-turn. Ridgeline wants to partner. We build a commercial-scale cidery operation here. State-of-the-art equipment, professional marketing distribution network. You'd retain ownership of the genetic material, receive royalties on every bottle sold. And in return, we develop 80% of the acreage for residential use. Luxury homes, boutique hotel, golf course. You'd keep the orchard section, we'd build around it. Your cider becomes the signature amenity of Harrison Valley Estates. He pulled out a tablet, showed me architectural renderings. Beautiful homes, manicured lawns, not a working farm in sight. You want to turn Thomas Rivers' legacy into a subdivision decoration. I want to make you wealthy while preserving what matters to you. The trees stay. The business thrives. Everyone wins. Except the actual farm. His jaw tightened. This is business, Rachel. Sentiment doesn't pay mortgages. Neither does destroying things that can't be replaced. I stepped closer. The answer is no. Riverbend isn't for sale. Not for partnership, not for development, not for any amount you want to name. You're making a mistake. We've purchased 700 acres around you. You'll be surrounded, isolated. Do you understand what that means for your water access, your property values, your entire operation? The threat hung between us clearer than if he'd shouted it. I understand perfectly. Now get off my property. He left. But his warning echoed in my head for hours after. Margaret's money ran out faster than either of us anticipated. Converting the small barn into a working cidery meant electrical upgrades, plumbing, ventilation systems. The contractor's initial estimate doubled when he found rot in the foundation. Every repair revealed 3 more problems. By mid-July, we'd spent $80,000 of the $175,000 Margaret had allocated. I had equipment, but no product, a building, but no cash flow, and winter coming fast. Gary had made cider in the 1970s, remembered enough to be dangerous. We found a used press on Craigslist, drove 4 hours to pick it up. Matthew watched YouTube videos about fermentation while I read technical manuals that might as well have been written in Sanskrit. Our first batch used conventional apples from a neighboring orchard. The heritage varieties wouldn't fruit until next season at earliest. 200 gallons of juice, carefully measured yeast temperature controlled to the degree. I monitored it like a newborn. Checked the fermentation tanks 3 times daily. Adjusted temperatures, measured specific gravity, did everything the manuals said to do. 2 weeks later, I opened the first tank and gagged on the smell. Vinegar, sharp enough to burn my nostrils. The entire batch had over-fermented, turned acidic, become completely unsaleable. $2,000 of apple supplies and electricity down the drain. Literally, Gary and I spent 3 hours dumping fouled cider and cleaning tanks. I sat on the barn floor afterward, back against the wall, and cried for the first time since we'd moved to Riverbend. Not delicate tears, ugly, shoulder-shaking sobs that hurt my chest. Gary found me there. Didn't say anything, just sat down beside me and waited until I could breathe again. Thomas wrote about 7 failures before his first successful harvest. Thomas wasn't supporting 2 children on rapidly disappearing savings. No. He was supporting a wife and fighting a depression that killed 3 banks. Different details, same fear. He handed me his handkerchief. You know what separated him from the farmers who gave up? He wrote down what went wrong. Learned. Tried again. What if I don't have enough tries left? Then you'll know you gave it everything. That count for nothing. It counted. But knowing that didn't pay bills or ease the sick feeling in my stomach when I calculated how little margin for error remained. We adjusted the temperature down 5 degrees for the second batch, changed yeast strains, monitored pH more carefully. Matthew suggested adding nutrients to support fermentation, something he'd learned from a video by a commercial cider maker in Oregon. 3 weeks later, I tasted the result and felt my eyes water for different reasons. It was good, actually genuinely good. Crisp and dry with a finish that lingered. Not perfect, but good enough to sell. Dorothy ordered 50 bottles for the diner. 3 local restaurants wanted to try samples. A specialty food store in the county seat asked about wholesale pricing. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. Margaret stopped answering my calls in August. The first time I assumed she was busy. The second time I worried. By the 4th unanswered call, I was scared. I drove to her house on a Tuesday afternoon, leaving Matthew and Michelle with Gary. The 45-minute drive felt like hours. Margaret's home sat on a quiet street in the neighboring town, a renovated craftsman that spoke of old money spent tastefully. The front door was unlocked. I knocked, got no answer, and let myself in anyway. Margaret, it's Rachel. Are you here? Silence. Then faintly from upstairs, Rachel. I found her in the master bedroom, propped against pillows that seemed to swallow her frame. She'd lost weight. Her skin had the grayish tint of someone fighting a war inside their own body. What happened? She tried to smile. Ovarian cancer. Came back 3 months ago. 3 months. Right around when we'd found the safe. Why didn't you tell me? Because you had enough to worry about. And because I didn't want you making decisions based on my health instead of the farm's future. She gestured weakly at the chair beside her bed. Sit. Tell me about the orchard. Margaret, please, let me hear about something growing instead of dying. So I told her. About Dr. Clark's findings, the unique varieties, the licensing agreement. About Kenneth Anderson's threats and offers. About the failed cider batch and the successful one. She listened with her eyes closed, and I couldn't tell if she was absorbing every word or just too tired to keep them open. When I finished, she opened her eyes. "You need to know something, Rachel, about why I chose Riverbend, why I chose you. You said I reminded you of yourself. That's true, but it's not the whole truth." Her breathing sounded labored. "When I lost my family's farm, it wasn't just foreclosure. My parents asked me to come home 3 times. They needed help, needed someone who understood contracts and negotiation. I was too busy building my career, too important to drop everything for a failing farm." She paused, gathered strength. "My father had a heart attack 6 months after the bank took the property. My mother followed him 8 months later. The doctor said it was complications from diabetes. But my aunt told me the truth. My mother died of a broken heart. She couldn't survive losing both her husband and the land they'd worked for 40 years. Margaret, I made enough money to buy that farm back 10 times over, but by the time I tried it was gone. Subdivision called Heritage Hills. They kept one barn as a decorative amenity for the community center." Her voice cracked. "I can't save my parents, can't undo what my ambition cost them, but I can help you keep what they lost. Does that make me selfish or generous? I honestly don't know." "It makes you human." "Maybe." She shifted in bed, winced. "I need to tell you something else. I'm starting chemotherapy next week. Aggressive treatment. I'll be in and out of the hospital for the next 3 to 6 months. My lawyers will manage the trust, but I won't be available for immediate decisions. The remaining capital for Riverbend is frozen until I can review and approve expenditures." The floor seemed to tilt. "How much do we have access to?" "What's already been allocated. Nothing more until I'm well enough to manage fund disbursements." She reached for my hand, gripped it with surprising strength. "You're going to have to do this on your own for a while, Rachel. Can you?" Every instinct screamed to say no, to admit I was barely holding together with her support, let alone without it. But Margaret was dying, and she needed to believe Riverbend would survive even if she didn't. "Yes, we'll make it work." Liar. But she smiled. "Thank you for lying." And the storm forecast came the first week of September. 70-mile-per-hour winds, 6 inches of rain. The Weather Service called it a nor'easter, said it would stall over Harrison County for 18 hours. Gary Matthew and I spent the day before trying to protect what we could, tied down the smallest saplings in the north orchard, moved equipment into the cidery, covered the fermentation tanks, secured anything that could become a projectile. By nightfall, we'd done everything possible. We retreated to the cottage and waited. The wind arrived first, not gradually, all at once, like someone had opened a door to hell. Trees bent double. The cottage windows rattled in their frames. Michelle pressed against me on the couch, hands over her ears. Matthew stood at the window watching destruction unfold in real time. "Mom, the barn roof." I looked, saw metal peeling away from the structure like someone opening a can, watched it tear free and tumble across the orchard, a deadly kite spinning in the wind. The power went out at midnight. We sat in darkness listening to apocalypse sounds. Every crash made me flinch, wondering what we'd just lost. The rain came sideways, found every gap in the cottage walls, created new ones where it couldn't find existing paths. Michelle fell asleep, eventually exhausted by fear. Matthew sat rigid beside me, trying to be brave. I held both my children and calculated the cost of every sound, every impact, every piece of our fragile new life being ripped away. Dawn came gray and merciless. The wind had died, the rain had stopped, and Riverbend Farm looked like a war zone. The barn's roof was gone, metal sheets scattered across 3 acres. The cidery had flooded, 6 inches of water on the floor, equipment submerged. In the north orchard, the devastation made me physically sick. 15 of the 50 ancient trees were down. Just gone. Snapped at the trunk or torn up by roots lying sideways like fallen soldiers. Of Thomas River's 5 unique varieties, 2 had been reduced to a single surviving specimen each. One wrong disease, one more storm, and they'd be extinct. Gary arrived at 7, took one look at my face, and pulled out his phone. "I'm calling my insurance guy and a structural engineer. Don't touch anything until we document the damage." The engineer showed up that afternoon, walked the property with a clipboard and a camera, making notes that felt like death sentences. His estimate arrived by email 3 hours later, $60,000 in immediate repairs. That didn't count replacing lost trees or the emotional cost of watching a century of genetics get cut in half by a single night. I had $3,000 in my account. Margaret was unreachable. The licensing money from the university wouldn't arrive for another month. For the first time since finding Thomas Rivers' letter, I thought I was wrong. This was a mistake. Kenneth Anderson's SUV appeared 2 days later, immaculate despite the mud still covering everything else. He stepped out wearing a different suit, but the same expression, sympathy calibrated to look genuine without actually being felt. "I heard about the storm. I'm sorry, Rachel." "Are you?" "I'm sorry you're facing this alone. That's not the same as being sorry you said no." He pulled out his tablet. $2.5 million. Cash. Close within a week. You walk away with enough to give your children a real future instead of... He gestured at the destruction, this. The number hung in the air between us. Bigger than anything I'd ever imagined having. Bigger than 6 years of waitressing tips. Bigger than the life insurance Christopher left. Bigger than safe. "Let me think about it." "You have 48 hours. After that, Ridgeline moves forward with development on the surrounding parcels. Your cooperation would be appreciated, but it's not required." After he left, I stood in the wreckage of the North Orchard and tried to imagine taking his money. Tried to picture Matthew's face when I told him we were leaving. Michelle's devastation at losing the bedroom with the window seat. Tried to remember what it felt like before I'd read Thomas Rivers' letter, before I'd believed in something larger than survival. I called Margaret's lawyer that night, got voicemail, left a message asking about the process for selling the property back to the trust. Hung up feeling like I'd betrayed everyone who'd helped us get this far. At 2 in the morning, I sat at the kitchen table with the sale documents Kenneth had emailed. 12 pages of legalese that boiled down to one question: was I strong enough to keep fighting or smart enough to quit while I still had something left? The pen felt heavy in my hand. My signature was all they needed. "Mom." Matthew stood in the hallway, backlit by the bathroom light, still half asleep but awake enough to see what I was considering. "Couldn't sleep, honey. Go back to bed." He sat across from me instead, looked at the papers, looked at my face. "You're going to sell?" "I don't know. Maybe. I can't..." My voice cracked. "I can't take care of you two anymore, Matthew. Not like this. Not with no money and no help and no way forward. Dad would say what... Dad's dead." The words came out harsher than I meant. Matthew flinched, but he didn't leave. "Before he died, Dad taught me something. He said real value isn't in bank accounts. It's in what you build that lasts. What you leave behind that matters." His voice steadied. "You taught me how to fight. You fought through Dad's death, through bills and debt and 6 years alone. Don't teach me to quit now when it actually matters." It's not quitting. It's being realistic. It's being scared. And that's okay. I'm scared too. He reached across the table. "But we're in this together, Mom. All 3 of us. Let us help carry it." Michelle appeared in the hallway. "I heard everything." "Sweetheart, go back to..." "No." She crossed to the table, placed her lucky rock next to the unsigned papers. "I want to show you something." We walked through pre-dawn darkness to the North Orchard. Michelle led us to the oldest tree, the specimen Dr. Clark had estimated at 120 years. The storm had broken it halfway up the trunk, left it listing at a 45-degree angle like a ship going down. Michelle pointed to the base. Where the trunk met the ground, new growth pushed through bark, fresh shoots pale green reaching for light despite the tree's destruction. "Trees don't quit. We don't either." The simplicity of it hit me like a physical blow. This tree had survived droughts and floods and 100 years of uncertainty. It had been broken, but it was already trying to heal. Maybe that was the lesson Thomas River had really left. Not the genetics in his apples, but the stubbornness in his faith. I took the sale documents and tore them in half, then in half again. Let the pieces fall like snow around my daughter's lucky rock. "We're staying." Matthew exhaled hard. Michelle hugged me, and somewhere in the damaged orchard broken trees prepared to fight their way back to life. I called Kenneth at 8 a.m. "The answer is no. Riverbend isn't for sale." He was quiet for 3 seconds. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "Good." The loan took a week to arrange. $40,000 at 12% interest secured against every piece of equipment we owned, plus my lease agreement with the trust. Highway robbery interest rates, but beggars couldn't be choosers. The money bought us breathing room. Enough to repair the barn roof, replace damaged equipment, hire help for the harvest. Not enough to feel secure, but enough to keep fighting. News filtered through the county grapevine. Kenneth Anderson had withdrawn from part of the surrounding development, scaled back his plans. Nobody knew why, but speculation ran wild. Some said Ridgeline's board had gotten nervous about overextension. Others thought they were regrouping for a bigger push. I didn't care about the reason. I cared that the immediate pressure had eased, even if 400 acres of Ridgeline-owned land still circled us like a noose waiting to tighten. Robert White found me in the orchard one afternoon examining storm damage. "Been thinking about what you said at the cleanup, about Riverbend not being able to survive alone." "I remember." "What if none of us survive alone? What if we need each other more than we're admitting?" He pulled off his cap, worked it in his hands. "I talked to some of the other farmers. We're all feeling pressure from Ridgeline, from changing markets, from being too small to compete. But together, we might have a chance." He nodded. "I'm thinking cooperative. Shared marketing, shared equipment, shared legal resources. You interested?" Dorothy's Diner became our unofficial headquarters. 12 farmers showed up for the first meeting, ranging from Robert's dairy operation to organic vegetable growers to a beekeeper who'd lost half her hives to pesticide drift from Ridgeline's landscaping operations. I stood at the front of the room feeling like an imposter. 6 months ago, I'd been serving these people coffee. Now I was proposing we band together to fight a development company with resources that dwarfed our combined net worth. Harrison Heritage Agricultural Cooperative. That's what I'm proposing. We pool resources for marketing, share expensive equipment, create legal protections through designated agricultural preservation zones. And we stand together when companies like Ridgeline try to pick us off one at a time. Silence greeted my pitch. Then Robert stood. "This makes economic sense, not just defensive sense. Collective marketing means we can reach customers none of us could access alone. Shared equipment means we don't all need to own a $50,000 tractor. This isn't charity, it's smart business." 8 of the 12 committed before we left that night. 4 more said they'd think about it. One farmer older set in his ways, shook his head, and left without a word. But 8 was enough to start. I called Margaret that night, got her on the 3rd ring. Her voice sounded weak but present. "How are you feeling?" Like death warmed over, but not dead yet. A pause. "Tell me something good, Rachel." "We're forming a cooperative. 8 farms so far, maybe more. Robert White is co-chairing with me. We're applying for Heritage Agricultural Preservation Zone designation from the county." The silence on the line stretched so long I thought she'd fallen asleep. Then, "I'm proud of you." 3 words. But they carried the weight of everything Margaret had hoped for when she'd bought Riverbend and handed me the keys to an impossible dream. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." "Yes, you could have. You just didn't know it yet." Her breathing sounded labored. "The cooperative is smart, Rachel. Gives you legal standing, community support, political leverage. When you face the county commission, if we face them, When? Ridgeline won't roll over quietly. They'll fight the preservation zone. You'll need to be ready. I will be. Good. Because this isn't just about Riverbend anymore. It's about whether communities have the right to determine their own future or whether companies with deeper pockets make those decisions for them. That's the fight you're in now. Win or lose it matters. After we hung up, I stood on the cottage porch and looked across the orchard. Trees stood silhouetted against the sunset, damaged but enduring. Matthew and Michelle's voices floated from inside, arguing about whose turn it was to do dishes. Normal sounds, home sounds. For 6 years I'd been surviving, playing defense, protecting what little we had left, but standing there breathing air that tasted like earth and apples. And possibility, I realized something had shifted. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building. And maybe, just maybe, what we built here would outlast us all. Thomas River had believed that enough to plant trees for strangers. The least I could do was fight to keep them standing. Ridgeline Development's response came faster than expected. 3 weeks after Robert White and I filed the Heritage Agricultural Preservation Zone petition with Harrison County, their lawyers submitted a 40-page opposition brief that made our 10-page proposal look like a child's book report. The county scheduled a public hearing for the 3rd week of November. Neutral ground, they called it. The high school gymnasium, 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. Television cameras allowed. I'd never spoken in front of more than 20 people before. Never testified at anything remotely resembling a government hearing. The closest I'd come was asking the school board to reconsider Matthew's transfer when we'd first arrived in Harrison County. Now I was preparing to stand before hundreds of people and argue why protecting farmland mattered more than economic development, against lawyers who did this professionally, against a company with marketing budgets larger than my life savings. Margaret's lawyer helped pro bono, coached me over phone calls that grew shorter as her treatment intensified. Stick to facts, lead with heart, but support with numbers. Don't let them make you defensive. You're not stopping progress. You're defining what real progress looks like for your community. Easy to say. Harder to believe at 2 in the morning when I practiced my speech to an empty cottage and heard how small my voice sounded. The cooperative met twice weekly in Dorothy's back room. Robert brought financial projections showing how preservation zones had worked in other counties. Dr. Clark agreed to testify about the scientific value of heritage genetics. Dorothy organized a phone tree to ensure community members showed up to the hearing. But Ridgeline moved faster. They hired the county's most prominent law firm, placed full-page ads in the newspaper highlighting job creation and tax revenue, commissioned an economic impact study that made our preservation zone look like economic suicide. The ads hurt most. Glossy photos of families in front of beautiful homes, captions asking, "Don't our children deserve opportunity?" As if protecting farmland meant stealing futures from kids who needed work. Matthew saw me staring at one such ad spread across the kitchen table. "They're good at this." "Yeah. So we need to be better." He opened his laptop, pulled up the presentation he'd been building. Charts showing the economic contribution of sustainable agriculture, data on agritourism, employment numbers from heritage food businesses in comparable counties. I talked to Ms. Chen at school. She used to work in marketing before she started teaching. She helped me put this together. My 14-year-old son had built a counter-argument more sophisticated than anything I could have managed. Pride and heartbreak tangled in my chest. He should be worried about homework and friends, not economic development policy. But he was in this fight because I'd brought us here, because I'd chosen risk over safety and dragged both children along. It's really good, Matthew. It'll be better when I add the university's licensing agreement. $20,000 a year from genetic research shows real economic value from preservation, right? Right. He looked at me, really looked, and I saw Christopher in his eyes. The same stubborn optimism that had made my husband believe a coffee shop dream could work despite every practical objection I'd raised. "We're going to win, Mom." "You know why?" "Why?" "Because they're fighting for profit. We're fighting for home, and home always means more. I wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that righteousness trumped resources, that David really could beat Goliath if his cause was just enough. But I'd spent 6 years learning that the world didn't work that way, that good people lost all the time and wanting something badly didn't make it happen. Still, Matthew believed, and maybe that had to be enough. Kenneth Anderson's SUV appeared in my driveway the Saturday before the hearing. For once he came alone. No tablet, no suit jacket, just jeans and a button-down shirt that made him look almost human. I met him on the porch, kept my hand near the door handle. Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying. I'm not here to sell anything. I'm here to tell you the truth. He stayed near his car, maintaining distance like he knew how close I was to slamming the door in his face. Can I have 10 minutes? Why should I give you 10 seconds? Because I'm about to hand you evidence that could destroy Ridgeline's case. And because I owe you an explanation. That stopped me. I gestured to the porch steps. Talk. He sat first, leaving me the psychological high ground. Deliberate, probably, but I took it anyway. Ridgeline's environmental impact assessment for the Harrison Valley Estates development is fraudulent. They hired a consulting firm known for rubber stamping projects, buried negative findings about watershed impact, and falsified data about sustainable water usage. He pulled a flash drive from his pocket, set it on the step between us. That drive contains the original assessment before it was edited, plus internal emails showing management knew about the discrepancies. I stared at the drive like it might explode. Why are you giving this to me? Because 3 days ago I watched my daughter's school concert. She's 10. Played violin in the beginner ensemble, wasn't very good yet, but she was trying so hard. His voice went rough around the edges. Afterward, she asked me about my job, what I build. I started explaining Harrison Valley Estates, the homes, the amenities, the community vision, and she asked me, "But Daddy, what happens to the farms?" He picked up a piece of gravel, turned it over in his palm. I told her they weren't productive anymore, that we were bringing new life to dying land. She looked at me like I'd disappointed her and said, "My teacher says farms grow food. Won't people need food more than golf courses?" The silence stretched between us. Somewhere in the orchard a crow called. I couldn't answer her, Rachel. Couldn't explain why erasing agricultural history made sense when she'd just learned about the Dust Bowl, and what happens when we forget land has purpose beyond profit. He met my eyes. I've spent 15 years convincing myself that development equals progress, that replacing old with new is always improvement. Your daughter stood up in that gymnasium during the last public comment period and asked a question I can't stop thinking about. If Thomas River could think 100 years ahead, why can't we think 10? Michelle had spoken at the preliminary hearing 3 weeks ago. 2 minutes of a 10-year-old's earnest belief that trees mattered more than money. I'd thought it was cute. Kenneth had apparently thought it was devastating. So you're having a crisis of conscience. I'm realizing I've been on the wrong side, and that I helped create a legal strategy designed to bury legitimate environmental concerns under paperwork and economic projections that cherry-pick data. He stood. I quit Ridgeline yesterday. They'll fight the preservation zone harder now, new leadership that doesn't have my hesitations, but you'll have ammunition they don't know you possess. Why not take this to the press yourself? Because I need to not be the hero of this story. I need to be the villain who finally did one right thing. He headed toward his SUV, paused with his hand on the door. I can't undo the farms I've already helped destroy. Can't bring back what's gone. But maybe I can stop it from happening again. That count for anything. Ask me after the hearing. He nodded, climbed into his vehicle and drove away. I picked up the flash drive, felt its weight against my palm, opened my laptop right there on the porch and started reading. Kenneth hadn't lied. The documents were damning. Original environmental assessments showing that Harrison Valley Estates would deplete the aquifer within 15 years, contaminate groundwater with chemical runoff from golf course maintenance, and irreversibly alter watershed flow patterns. All of it edited, minimized, or deleted from the final version submitted to the county. Margaret's lawyer responded to my email within an hour. This changes everything. We can force an independent environmental review, delay their development by years, maybe kill it entirely. The hearing was 4 days away. 4 days to decide whether to use Kenneth's evidence publicly or hold it in reserve, whether to trust a man who'd been trying to destroy us 6 weeks ago. I called Robert White. We need to meet, tonight. All cooperative members. The high school gymnasium held 400 people comfortably. By 6:30 Tuesday evening, 500 were crammed inside with another 100 standing in hallways, hoping to hear through open doors. Every television station within a 50-mile radius had cameras set up. The county commission sat at a long table on the stage, looking overwhelmed by the turnout. Chairman Davidson banged his gavel 3 times before the crowd settled enough for him to speak. We're here to consider Petition HC 2024-47, requesting establishment of the Harrison Heritage Agricultural Preservation Zone. This is a public hearing. Both sides will present their cases followed by public comment. We will deliberate and vote tonight. Please maintain civility. Ridgeline's lawyers went first. 3 attorneys in matching Navy suits armed with PowerPoint presentations and the kind of polish that came from winning most of the time. They painted a picture of economic renaissance, 120 jobs at the hotel and golf course, 46 luxury homes generating sustainable tax revenue infrastructure improvements that would benefit the entire county. Their environmental consultant testified that all impact concerns had been thoroughly addressed. Their economist projected $5 million in new revenue over 10 years. Their architect showed renderings of a development so beautiful it looked like a fantasy. Then their lead attorney delivered the killing blow. The petitioners ask you to freeze this county in amber, to prioritize nostalgia over opportunity, to tell young people that Harrison County has no room for their futures unless they want to milk cows or pick apples. He paused for effect. Progress requires change, and change requires courage to move beyond what's comfortable into what's possible. Half the room applauded, the other half sat silent. My turn. I walked to the podium feeling my legs shake, placed my notes down, looked out at faces I'd served coffee to farmers I'd met through the cooperative strangers who'd come, because this decision would shape their county's future. Margaret sat in the 3rd row, skeletal but present. She'd checked herself out of the hospital that morning against medical advice, caught my eye and nodded once. I took a breath and started speaking. 6 months ago, I was a waitress with 2 kids and no prospects. Riverbend Farm gave me more than a home. It gave me a chance to build something that could outlast me. That's not nostalgia. That's investing in the future the same way Thomas River did when he planted trees he'd never see reach maturity. My voice steadied as I continued. Ridgeline's presentation was beautiful, but beauty without substance is just decoration. They showed you renderings. I'm showing you reality. I nodded to Matthew, who started the slideshow we'd prepared. Dr. Clark's DNA analysis appeared on screen. These are genetic markers from apple varieties that exist nowhere else on Earth. They survived a century of neglect because Thomas River bred them to be resilient. The university is paying $20,000 annually to study them. That's economic value from preservation, not development. Next slide, the licensing agreements with 3 commercial nurseries. Another $30,000 a year from trees Ridgeline wanted to bulldoze. Charts showing employment numbers from the cooperative. Tourism data from heritage agricultural regions. Tax revenue from sustainable farming operations that lasted decades instead of building cycles that peaked and crashed. The preservation zone doesn't stop growth. It directs growth toward sustainability, toward businesses that can endure beyond the next quarterly earnings report. I paused, let the numbers sink in. But this isn't really about economics. It's about what we value. Ridgeline wants to replace working farmland with golf courses and call it progress. I'm asking progress toward what a county where agriculture is a theme for luxury amenities instead of the foundation of our economy. Robert White stood. I'm third generation on my dairy farm. My grandfather broke this land. My father sustained it. I'm passing it to my sons. That's not nostalgia, that's legacy. And legacy is the longest investment there is. Dorothy raised her hand. I've run the diner for 30 years. You know what my customers talk about: the farms disappearing, the families leaving, the character bleeding out of this county one subdivision at a time. Riverbend staying agricultural isn't about the past, it's about having a recognizable future. The testimonies multiplied. Farmers, teachers, shop owners, young people who wanted to stay in Harrison County but needed it to remain the place they loved. Then Michelle stood. I hadn't known she planned to speak again. Hadn't prepared her or coached her. She walked to the podium, needed Gary to adjust the microphone down to her height. My name is Michelle Flores. I'm 10. Her voice shook but held. When we moved to Riverbend, I thought it was just a farm, but my mom taught me it's more than dirt and trees. It's Thomas River trusting that someone would care 100 years later. It's people choosing to protect instead of profit. If Mr. River could think that far ahead, why can't we? The silence after she finished felt sacred. Chairman Davidson cleared his throat, visibly moved. Ridgeline's lead attorney stood for rebuttal. Respectfully, Commissioner, this is emotional manipulation. Jobs aren't nostalgia. Revenue isn't sentiment. The choice before you is simple. Do you want Harrison County to grow, or do you want it to stagnate? I rose again. Chairman Davidson, may I present one final piece of evidence? He nodded. I inserted Kenneth's flash drive into the laptop, pulled up the original environmental assessment. This is Ridgeline's internal environmental study before they edited it for public submission. It shows their development would deplete the aquifer within 15 years, contaminate groundwater with chemical runoff, and permanently alter watershed patterns. I let that sink in. They knew this, and they buried it. The room erupted. Commissioners leaned forward, reading the documents Matthew projected. Ridgeline's lawyers huddled, whispering urgently. Their lead attorney's face went red. This is privileged information illegally obtained. It's evidence of fraud submitted to a government body. Margaret's lawyer stood every inch the courtroom veteran. And whistleblower protections apply to anyone who reveals environmental violations. We'll be filing for an independent review immediately. Chairman Davidson banged his gavel until the room quieted. We'll take a 30-minute recess while the commission reviews these new documents. The gymnasium buzzed with conversation during the break. News crews surrounded me, asking questions I barely heard. Matthew and Michelle appeared at my elbows, and I pulled them close. Michelle was shaking. You were so brave, sweetheart. I was scared. Brave isn't not being scared. Brave is doing it anyway. The commissioners returned, looking grave. Chairman Davidson's expression gave nothing away as he called the room to order. We've reviewed the new evidence. We've heard testimony from both sides. The commission will now deliberate in open session as required by law. Commissioner Morrison spoke first. The environmental concerns are serious. We can't approve development on fraudulent assessments. Commissioner Lee countered, but we also can't ignore the economic benefits. 120 jobs is significant for this county. Commissioner Park. Jobs built on depleting our water supply aren't sustainable. What happens in 20 years when the aquifers dry? Commissioner Rodriguez. The preservation zone allows controlled development. It doesn't prohibit growth. It requires compatibility with existing agriculture. Back and forth for 20 minutes. The room held its collective breath. Finally, Chairman Davidson called for a vote. All in favor of establishing the Harrison Heritage Agricultural Preservation Zone as outlined in Petition HC-2024-47. Aye. Morrison. Aye. Park. Aye. Rodriguez. 3. We needed 3. Opposed? Nay. Lee. Nay. Commissioner Thompson. Chairman Davidson paused. The deciding vote was his. He looked at Ridgeline's lawyers, then at me, then at the crowd that had packed his gymnasium. I've lived in Harrison County my entire life. watched farms disappear, watched character fade. I understand the appeal of development, but I also understand that some things once lost can't be replaced. He took a breath. 3-2. The preservation zone passed. The room exploded with cheers and angry shouts in equal measure. Ridgeline's lawyers stormed out. People I barely knew hugged me. Matthew lifted Michelle onto his shoulders. Dorothy cried into her husband's shirt. Margaret sat motionless, tears streaming down her face. I pushed through the crowd to reach her. "We did it. You did it. I just gave you the chance." She gripped my hands with strength that belied her fragile frame. "Thank you for making it matter." Outside, as the crowd dispersed, I found Kenneth Anderson leaning against his SUV in the parking lot. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't scowling either. "Congratulations." "Thank you. For the evidence." "Don't thank me. I spent 15 years on the wrong side of this fight. One honest act doesn't erase that." He pushed away from his vehicle. "I'm starting a consulting firm, helping developers and communities find balance instead of conflict. Probably won't make a tenth of what Ridgeline paid me, but maybe I'll sleep better. Good luck. Rachel, I owe you more than evidence. I owe you an apology." His voice dropped. "I tried to destroy something irreplaceable because destroying things was easier than preserving them. That makes me complicit in everything wrong with how we approach land community legacy. I can't undo it, but I can try not to repeat it." "Then don't." He climbed into his SUV and drove away. I watched his taillights disappear and felt no triumph, no vindication, just exhausted relief and the faint hope that people could change if they wanted to, badly enough. 3 months later, Riverbend Farm hosted the inaugural River Legacy cider launch and cooperative celebration. 300 people showed up to tour the orchard, taste cider, and celebrate what felt like victory, even though the real work was just beginning. The bottles Matthew designed sold out in 2 hours. Restaurants from 3 counties placed orders. The specialty food store in the county seat asked about exclusive distribution rights. Small victories building toward sustainability, Dr. Clark announced that the university's research had identified potential pharmaceutical applications for compounds in one of Thomas River's varieties. Patent applications pending. Revenue projections that made my head spin. The cooperative had grown to 22 farms, a shared equipment pool, collective marketing that had increased everyone's reach, applications for grants that none of us could have qualified for individually. Margaret moved into the small cottage Gary had fixed up on the far edge of the property. Her cancer had stabilized, not cured, but manageable with treatment. She wanted to spend whatever time she had left watching things grow instead of sitting in a hospital room watching herself diminish. Kenneth Anderson sent monthly contributions to a scholarship fund he'd established in Thomas River's name. Matthew and Michelle were the first recipients. Not redemption, maybe, but effort toward something better than he'd been. Matthew started a blog documenting heritage agriculture, got 10,000 followers in 6 weeks. Colleges were already sending recruiting letters. Michelle's herb garden produced enough to sell at the farmer's market. She kept meticulous records of everything she grew, talked about studying botany when she got older. And I stood in the orchard every morning before sunrise watching light filter through branches that had survived a century of storms because someone believed they mattered enough to protect. The farmhouse restoration was halfway complete. Another year and we could move in. Michelle would get her window seat. Matthew would get the room with the built-in bookshelves. I'd get space to breathe without feeling walls close in. The evening after the celebration, I sat alone in the farmhouse parlor with Thomas River's journal. The room smelled like fresh paint and sawdust and possibility. I opened to the last page where I'd written 3 months ago, added a new entry below it. Thomas, the cooperative succeeded. The preservation zone passed. Your trees are protected. More than that, they're thriving. We harvested our first commercial crop from your varieties. Made cider that tastes like history and hope mixed together. People drove 50 miles to buy bottles because they wanted to taste what 100 years of patience produces. Matthew asks me sometimes if I ever regret buying Riverbend, if the struggle was worth it. I tell him what you wrote to build something enduring requires effort worthy of that endurance. We've given everything we have to this place, and it's given us back more than dirt and trees. It's given us purpose, community, a future we're building deliberately instead of just surviving accidentally. Thank you for believing in tomorrow enough to plant for it. I hope wherever you are, you know your faith wasn't wasted. I closed the journal, carried it to the new bookshelf Gary had installed. It belonged here in the house Thomas built, surrounded by the legacy he'd trusted to strangers. Outside, twilight painted the orchard in shades of gold and shadow. Matthew and Michelle's laughter carried from the cottage. Margaret's light glowed in her window. Gary's truck rumbled down the drive, heading home after another day of work that never quite ended on a farm. Christopher would have loved this, would have walked these fields and talked about the coffee shop we'd build someday in the barn, the farm-to-table dinners we'd host, all the dreams I'd called impractical. But standing there watching everything we'd fought for take root, I realized Christopher had taught me something more valuable than any specific dream, that the only dreams worth having are the ones big enough to outlast you. Thomas River planted trees for people he'd never meet. I was raising children who'd inherit more than property. They'd inherit proof that some things matter more than safety, that risk and faith aren't weaknesses, but foundations. If you spend your whole life avoiding uncertainty, you never learn what you're capable of building when you finally let yourself try. 6 years ago, I was a widow pouring coffee and counting pennies, too afraid to imagine anything beyond next month's rent. Now I was standing in a century-old farmhouse running a business that employed 3 people, leading a cooperative that protected 22 families, raising children who believed they could change things because they'd watched their mother refuse to quit. Riverbend hadn't just given me a home, it had given me back myself. I walked to the porch, breathed air that tasted like earth and apples and tomorrow. Somewhere in the orchard, those ancient trees stood sentinel. Broken by storms, but still growing. Scarred by time, but still bearing fruit. Like all the best things they'd learned, that surviving isn't the same as living and that roots run deeper than fear.